Это вот, который проверит.
Раз. Коллеги дорогие, садитесь, заканчивайте разговоры, пожалуйста. Заканчивайте разговоры и садитесь. Вот. Я вас приветствую всем в очень пафосном зале. Ну, какой бы он ни был пафосный, Эмилия не такое побеждала. И я хотела бы вам это сказать, что те, кто владеют английским хорошо и свободно и могут слушать так, можете слушать так. Те, кто сидят за столами и вам нужен перевод, перед вами должны быть такие вот наушники, которые вы прямо на столах есть входы, где надо их воткнуть, да, и, соответственно, первый канал русский, второй английский. То есть есть настройка громкости, значит, найдите это все, сделайте, и вам будет все хорошо. Те, кто не за столами сидит на стульях или как-то планирует что-то перемещаться, вы можете уже либо взять вот такие приемнички. Вот, на них, в общем, все тоже довольно понятно. Здесь прямо на самой панели кнопка «Включить». С одной стороны регулируется громкость, с другой стороны каналы. Опять, то есть наушник на себя, все понятно. Все, мы начинаем.
Проверьте, пожалуйста, работают ли у вас приемники. Если что-то не так, то поднимите руки, дайте нам как-то понять, что вам нужна помощь. Добрый вечер. Меня зовут Лина Коган-Лернер. Я преподаватель магистерской программы «Системная семейная психотерапия» Высшей школы экономики. И я очень рада видеть вас всех здесь. И я очень рада и очень благодарна Эмили за то, что она сегодня с нами. И это такой огромный подарок нашей магистерской программе. И я думаю, что всем тем, кто здесь находится. Потому что подобные лекции, подобные мероприятия, в общем, редко случаются. И мы очень рады, что мы стали такой площадкой для этого события. Спасибо большое. Я думаю, что я хочу передать слово еще своей коллеге Марине Травковой, которая немножко представит Эмили и расскажет, что нас сегодня ожидает.
Ну, я думаю, что все, кто сюда пришел, в общем-то, вам Эмили уже в представлении не нуждается, и судя по фотосессии и по сессии автографов уже что-то случившееся, тем более. Вот, и из дальнейшего вам тоже будет понятно. Все это происходит в рамках того, что мы затеяли еще, которая прошла на выходных, и кто-то на ней был, конференцию. И сегодня это такой ее кусок и продолжение именно для нашей программы. Вот, наслаждайтесь. Спасибо, что ты с нами. Thank you that you are here.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderfully kind words that were translated for me. Thank you very much, translator folks in the back. Yes, I'm Emily Nagоски. I've been a sex educator for about 25 years. Holy crap. And this is my first time in Moscow. I can tell you that on the plane over here, I sat next to a 50-something Russian woman who was really excited that it was my first time in Russia. And she said, "Oh, you're coming for work? What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a sex educator." And she went, "You're a six? Educator? A six educator?" "No, a sex educator, like marriage and family. I'm trying desperately not to go like this on the plane." So when she finally understands, she literally does this. Ah! And I thought, well, that teaches me something a little bit about where I am going. And it turns out that was not too... It was a little bit like where I have been, but it's also not at all, because the fact that this conference has happened, the fact that I had lunch with a bunch of sex bloggers, the fact that I am here in the first place indicates to me that this is not a culture where people are afraid to talk about sex, but it might be a place where people are searching for a vocabulary that feels comfortable, even in situations where they wouldn't usually feel comfortable talking about sex. So most of what I want to do tonight is offer you the kind of vocabulary that you can use professionally and even in personal settings where you can talk about sexuality in a way that helps avoid the fear and negative emotional reaction that people tend to have, so that no one else ever has to go, ah! when you're talking about sex. Does that sound good? I have a couple of notes, basically, of what I want to talk about, but I also want to mention that you're going to go home tonight, you're going to go somewhere, and people are going to say, hey, where'd you go? Well, I heard this sex educator talk. Oh, really? What did you learn? So as I speak, I would like you to be thinking about what answer you would like to be able to give people, and be ready to ask a question so that you will have that answer to give them. Well, I learned the most amazing thing, because when I asked this, I learned that. I am a big fan of questions. I want to leave lots of time for them, but I also want to talk a lot about my own ideas. But the better the questions are, the more it's not just me talking about the things. Okay, let us start with an analogy. On Sunday, we visited the Museum of Soviet Arcade Games at the request of my husband, who is a cartoonist and a collector of arcade games, and they're very hard to play. They are so hard to play that as we were playing them, I joked, ugh, this thing is rigged. They tell you to play by one rule, but actually you're playing by a totally different set of rules, and there's no way to win. And after I said it, I went, and that's not a metaphor for anything. And Maxime, the guy we were with, said, no, it's not a metaphor for anything. It is a straightforward description of everything. And I thought, you're my kind of guy. And I thought, that's exactly what's going on with sexuality, it's going on with sex therapy, and it's going on with sex education. My goal tonight is to talk about the actual rules of the game, which are not the same as the rules we were all taught growing up. The difference between the rules we were taught and the game as it's actually played, that gap is the reason so many people feel so crazy and broken so much of the time. So let's talk about what the actual rules of the game are. While I do that, I'm going to be blending, talking about the science of sexuality, all the brain science, I love the brain science, along with the pedagogy. What are the teaching strategies that are most effective in communicating these ideas? Like, what makes Come As You Are a book that people can actually learn something from instead of being like, afraid of it? Does that make sense as a starting point? Okay. Let me begin with the difference between sex education and sex therapy. I was actually originally training as a sex therapist. My master's degree is in counseling psychology. I did a clinical internship at the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction, learning sex therapy, doing sensate focus, the most classic sex therapy. And about halfway through that program, I realized I am not by temperament a therapist. I do not have the certain special something that it takes to sit in a room week after week and listening to someone talk about their problems very patiently, going, and how did that make you feel? value that trait. I have had a therapist for 12 years. She has that trait. I have watched the expression on her face when I finally figure something out that she has obviously known for 7 years and has just been waiting for me to see it. I don't have that. So instead, I am an educator. What an educator does is say to a student, here is a map of the terrain. Here are some of the tools that you will need on your journey across this terrain. I may even give you lessons in how to use these tools. I may even help you learn to read the map, and then I send you on your way. The therapist is the one who goes into the terrain with you. Like you go on a little adventure, and then you come to your therapist's office, and she sits with you and says, and what is it like to be in this place in the terrain? What tool do you think you might pick next? How do you feel about the choice of tool you used on this occasion? How did that work for you? What do you think you might do differently this time? How does this remind you of the way you use tools in your family of origin? That's the difference between education and therapy. Not all sex educators are therapists. I am not a therapist. But all therapists are sex educators. Welcome. I want to help you have a toolkit. Of course, I want to give you a map and a toolkit of ways to talk with clients about sexuality that will not trigger your own stuff and will not trigger the client's own stuff. So let's begin with the simple. Begin at the beginning, the brain mechanism that governs sexual response. It's called the dual control model. If it's called the dual control model, how many parts does it have? It has 2 parts. And if the first part is the sexual accelerator, or the gas pedal, that means the second part must be the brake. So the sexual accelerator notices all the sex-related information in the environment. This is everything that your brain sees, hears, smells, touches, tastes, or, crucially, imagines that your brain codes as sex-related, and it sends the turn-on signal. From a pedagogical perspective, from a teaching point of view, I would just point out that I said those in a sensory order that goes from distance to closeness: see, hear, smell, touch, taste, and imagine. You go from the outside in. It helps people to feel less threatened. Okay, so the gas pedal functions at a low level all the time, including right now. The fact that we're talking about sex is just a little bit sex-related, so you have just a little bit of turn-on signal being sent even right now. Fortunately, at the same time, your brake also works all the time, noticing all the very good reasons not to be turned on right now. Everything that you see, hear, smell, touch, taste, or imagine that your brain codes as a potential threat. So the process of becoming aroused is a dual process of turning on the ons and turning off the offs. And it's the brake that's the real revolution in changing how we think about sexual functioning. Because for decades, the assumption was that if people were struggling with arousal, pleasure, desire, orgasm, the difficulty was that there was not enough stimulation to that accelerator. And sometimes that's true. But most of the time, the difficulty is that there is too much stimulation to the brake, because there's so many different kinds of things that can hit the brake. We talked about some of them on Saturday. Stress. My whole second book is about stress, because of how much of an issue this is. Not only is stress virtually ubiquitous, but the ways that we are taught to manage stress are totally wrong. really quick story. Okay, so my sister has a doctorate in choral conducting. She's a choral conductor. She is the only woman ever to finish her graduate program. No other woman has finished because of how toxically misogynist the program is, and it hospitalized her twice. That's how stressed it was. The first time she was put in the hospital, she was there for 4 days. They could not figure out what was wrong, so they told her it was just stress, and the treatment was just relax. Like, oh, great, thanks. If I knew how to do that, I wouldn't be here. So I started teaching her the things that are in Come As You Are about completing the stress response cycle, about how stress is a biological cycle with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you have to let your body move all the way through the cycle. Stress is not as simple as this, like, you get stressed out, which is hitting the accelerator, so you just hit the brakes in the middle of that stress response. No, the stress will just sit there. If you hit the brakes in the middle of a stress response, you just hit the pause button on your stress, and the stress will stay there, spinning its wheels somewhere in your body. You can probably identify where in your body you hold that stress. For me, it's in my shoulders. For my sister, obviously, it was her digestive system, and it destroyed her appendix. So that's fun. For some people, it's in their knees or their joints, or they get sort of halo migraine headaches. That's how stress manifests. And when that happens, the goal is not to just not feel stressed, but to allow your body to release the stress with something like physical activity or hugs or laughter. So the reason the whole second book I wrote is about stress is because people kept telling me that the stress was the most important chapter in the book. So stress is something that hits the brakes. Another thing is body image. There's multiple evidence-based strategies for dealing with body image. This is a thing that I have talked with a lot of women about here in Moscow. It feels like the pressure around body image and beauty is extremely intense. Maybe it's just in this city, maybe it's nationally. I know that in New York and LA, for example, the pressure around thinness and beauty is more intense than it is in other places in America. So maybe it's particularly in Moscow or big cities that it's like super intense, but it's toxic. It's literally poisoning us. It kills women. Disordered eating, for example, has a higher mortality rate than any other mental illness, including depression. But also it's messing with our sex lives. It's preventing us from having spectacular orgasms, and I think that's an important factor too when we think about why to let go of the culturally constructed aspirational ideal. And I want to recognize how complicated that is. I talked to a journalist today from a magazine who was showing me questions from readers. And one of the questions was, what do I do about the fact that my husband tells me, with legs like yours, no one else would ever love you? And since my answer couldn't be, divorce him, I started talking about a phenomenon that my sister and I have called human giver syndrome. So this comes from a book called Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny by Kate Mann. It is a brilliant book. It is very dark, but short. So if you have the emotional and mental space, I really highly recommend it. In it, she posits a world where there are two types of beings. There are two types of humans. There are human beings who have a moral obligation to be their full humanity, to take and obtain anything it takes to achieve their full potential. They feel entitled to do whatever it takes. And then the other kind of human is the human giver. who has a moral obligation to give their full humanity to the human beings. Kate Mann describes the human givers as the loving subordinates who will cheerfully give their time, their attention, their energy, their affection, their bodies, their hopes and dreams, their lives, sacrificed on the altar of someone else's comfort and convenience. Guess which one women are? Yeah, the givers. This is, of course, that's a broad generalization. I personally am married to a man who is a giver, and the dynamic when you've got two givers in a relationship, I know that he will continue to give and give and give until he has nothing left because he loves me and supports me and is there for me, and we both have to work to notice his boundaries and make sure he's taking as good care of himself as he's taking care of me. And he does the same thing for me. So it's absolutely possible for there to be two givers in a relationship, even when they're different genders. But the cartoon version of this and how it shows up in the culture, and definitely how it shows up in a relationship where one partner can say to the other, no one could ever love you because of the shape of your legs, that's a stereotypical human giver, human being relationship. Human givers have a moral obligation. Here they are, the characteristics. Here is your job. Here is your moral obligation. It is to be pretty, happy, yet calm, generous, and attentive to the needs of others. And if you fall short, because this is your moral obligation, if you fall short of that, you deserve to be punished. And many human givers, if no one punishes them for the ways they fall short, they will just go ahead and punish themselves. We beat the shit out of ourselves for the ways that we fail to be pretty, happy, calm, generous, attentive to the needs of others. I should have noticed that this person needed something else, or it's my fault that my legs aren't the right shape, or like I gained whatever weight, or had a baby and therefore the shape of my body changed. I need to get my body back. You had a baby. You still have a body. You're good. You're all set. So beating the shit out of ourselves, human giver syndrome. Sometimes the answer, this human giver syndrome is the game underneath the rules we were explicitly taught. Underneath it all, it explains things like the pay gap. Why do women get paid less? Because they're expected to do work to care for people. It's not for the money. You don't deserve to gather and accumulate resources of your own. It explains something like the second shift. I don't know what the gap is. So first shift is your job. Second shift is housework and childcare. In the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada, which are among the most equal in the world, the gap is 26 hours a week of house care and childcare for women and 10 hours a week for men. Globally, it is 40 hours a week for women and 2 for men. Human giver syndrome. And why? Because women are just expected to be the ones who sacrifice their time, their energy, their sleep even. When I was reading the research, I discovered from the researchers the phrase, the third shift. First shift is your job. Second job is housework and childcare. Third shift is sleep. Women are simply expected to be the ones who sacrifice their sleep in case someone needs caretaking, to sacrifice it in a way that in a heterosexual relationship, the man would just never be expected to get up because his wife is unwell and she would really feel better if he brought her a cup of tea in the middle of the night. That's simply not the cultural expectation. Does that make sense? So let's put that in the context of sexuality. When you have a human giver and a human being in beginning a sexual connection, when it is assumed that the human giver has a moral obligation to give her attention, her love, her body to the human being who feels entitled to take and have anything he wants in order to achieve his, full humanity, you're in a really dangerous situation. Because does it really count as consent if both people assume that one person has an obligation to give? Is she ever really free to say yes or no? Maybe you guys have seen it. Have you seen the little tea video or read the blog post about how tea is like consent? It's this great little sort of like intro to consent where just because someone said yes to tea today doesn't mean they want tea with you tomorrow or the day after that or the day after that. Just because they had tea with you last night doesn't mean they want to wake up with you pouring tea down their throat. Just because they said yes to tea doesn't mean they might not change their mind. And if they change their mind, obviously you're not going to force them to drink the tea. And if you can understand how obvious it is that a person has to want the tea, then you can understand how obvious it is that a person has to want the sex. That's so helpful as like a beginner 101 understanding of consent. But what's actually going on in the brain of the person who's being offered tea? Person A says, would you like some tea? I would like to give you some tea. Person B, because of the dual control model, is thinking, well, so there are some things that I want and like. I want to see this person's teacups. I want to have some sugar and milk. I want to tell people that I had tea with this person. I want not to hurt this person's feelings. I want to follow the rules of this culture. And then there's some things I don't want. On the list of things I don't want, tea. What does that person say? Now add on top of that, person B, who's being offered tea, is a human giver, and person A is a human being who feels entitled to give person B all the tea they feel like giving them. And person B feels obliged to drink all the tea that person A wants them to drink. Does that make sense? I mean, no, it makes no sense. But does that make sense? When a couple comes to talk to you about their sex life, they are stewing in human giver syndrome. They both have walked into this relationship with these rules that neither of them was ever explicitly taught. It's very rare that we're explicitly taught these rules that underpin so much of the gender dynamics that we witness in mainstream culture. And because it's never been made explicit, they don't even know that they're making these assumptions. They don't even know that, like, the human being doesn't even know that he feels entitled. The reason Kate Mann uses language like human being instead of human taker is because he's not taking anything away from the human giver. Anything the human giver has is his already. Like, it's his rightful, he's entitled to it. It's his. So it's not taking from that point of view. And he doesn't even know. And he certainly doesn't know what it feels like to be on the other end of that and feel like you're not allowed to say no. I don't know if this is going to translate, but I talked to a British journalist who said, one of my favorite sayings is, you can't spell enough without no. Because anyway, you can't spell enough. So the difficulty is that with human giver syndrome, it is not that we are not saying no. It's that somebody asks if we want tea, and we say, no, thank you. And then what is that person's response? No, but I really want to give you this tea. Why don't you want tea? Is it, do you not like me? if you really cared about me, you would definitely accept this tea, but I want you to try this new tea that I just got. It really, it matters to me, please. And you say it again, I appreciate all that, and maybe another time. Right now, I'm just kind of not in the mood for tea. And the person says, well, I mean, if you're going to be like that, what does that even say about our relationship? And eventually, it just becomes easier to go ahead and drink the tea you didn't want in the first place than it was to keep defending your no. And neither person is explicitly aware that this is the dynamic. They both know that they're dissatisfied, and neither one is totally sure why. Does that make sense? Do you feel like maybe the language of human givers could make some things clear for the couples you might work with? It's a big idea, and not everyone is ready to talk about it. Because one of the dangerous things about human giver syndrome is that because human beings are entitled, there are many human beings who, one of the symptoms of human giver syndrome is not just that you believe a human giver has the need to be punished when they fall short. You also believe that these ideas are just true and right and real and not a construction of society that could potentially be changed. You think there's something essential about women as givers that it's just how it's supposed to be. Does that make sense? Okay. Both human giver syndrome and the dual control model are examples of using metaphors. The reason it's useful to talk about metaphors, to use metaphors when you're talking about sexuality, is because when you talk about sex directly, people have feelings. When I was, I guess, 11 years old, I was in the car with my mother. We were driving home from the library, and I think I must have seen this word in a book. And I asked my mom, Mom, what's vagina? I do not remember what she said, but I remember the flash of intense emotion that went through her sitting next to me. What I learned in that moment is whatever this vagina thing is, it is scary and dangerous, and I should never talk about it ever again, right? So when we talk about sexuality, like you yourself may have like your client brings up sexuality and you're like, feelings. Or you bring up sexuality and they're like, whoa, whoa. No, everything is fine. When we use metaphors, we can shortcut around that emotional reaction. So when I talk about something like arousal non-concordance, oh, this is my favorite one. There's this so arousal non-concordance is when there is a mismatch, a non-alignment between what's happening with a person's genital blood flow and how turned on they subjectively feel. It happens to all kinds of people. It's particularly common in women, but it happens to men too. For some reason, when it comes to sex, people find it really difficult to let go of the idea that a person's blood flow tells us more about what a person wants or likes than the person does. So when we switch to a different physiological response, it helps to like strip away the like, whoa! So instead, we talk about if you bit into, so here I am, I've got this lovely shiny apple and I take a bite into the apple and my mouth waters around the fruit and there's a worm in the apple and my mouth is watering. My mouth is watering around this wormy, gross apple. No one's gonna say to me, well, but Emily, you just don't want to admit how much you like it, right? Same goes for one of my favorite studies. This arousal non-concordance thing happens with every emotional and motivational system we have, including the experience of the chills when we listen to music. You know that feeling like, oh, it gave me chills. In this one research study, they have a camera right up close next to the person's arm, and they're watching for piloerection. Is the person's hair going to stand on end, which is the physiological correlate for getting the chills? And then they play the research participants the song, My Heart Will Go On. Once more, you open the door. My Heart Will Go On, remember from Titanic? Okay. Yeah, some people love it. Some people are like, Emily, stop. But it turns out there is zero correlation between a person experiencing the chills and piloerection. If you're Celine Dion, what matters more to you? Do you want people to walk out going, meh, but their hair stood on end? Or do you want them to walk out going, oh, I got the chills when she hit that high note, and their hair stayed flat? What matters more? Obviously, it's the subjective experience, right? I did an interview with this guy a couple of weeks ago. I was trying to explain this, and I told him the 50 Shades of Grey example. 50 Shades of Grey is in Russia, right? Okay, so 50 Shades. Let me first say I am not shit-talking 50 Shades of Grey. I am a reader of romance novels because I do a lot of work around sexual violence, and I require happily ever afters in my life. Romance novels are a place where I can get happily ever afters. So I had an open mind when I started reading it. It was not for me, but that's fine. It gave a lot of people a lot of pleasure, gave a lot of people a lot of orgasms, and it was released right in the depths of the economic crash of 2008. And I know for sure that it saved some small, locally owned feminist sex toy stores because it taught women that sex toys are a thing. And so they went for the first time in their life to this small, locally owned, feminist, woman-friendly sex toy store. It saved these businesses. There are a lot of great things about 50 Shades of Grey. But I mean, I didn't throw it against the wall until the first spanking scene. Okay, so Anastasia consents to this spanking. She does not want it, and she does not like it. I read very closely for even one word about pleasure, but no, it's all she like squirms to get away. Her face hurts. She's squinching it up so tight. It's all just pain, suffering. She doesn't want it. She doesn't like it, even though she consented to it. And then Christian Grey, our hero / spanker, puts his fingers in her vagina and says, "Feel this, Anastasia. Feel how much your body likes this. You're soaking just for me." What does Christian Grey get wrong there? What does her genital response tell him or her how much her body likes this? No. It's like my mouth watering when I bite into the wormy apple. Like, it's just a thing that happens. It's a sexually related stimulus that happened. Is it a sex-related stimulus for your romantic and sexual partner to be touching your naked butt? Absolutely. What he should have said, and what I still hope one day they will do a revision where it says, "Feel this, Anastasia. Feel how sexually relevant your body finds this stimulation." That gives me very little information about whether you wanted or liked it. Did you want it or like it? She did not. And here's the thing. The really dark part about this for me is that even though she later on in an email describes the experience as feeling debased, abused, and degraded, because her body responded, she believes him. because women get taught to trust other people's opinions about our bodies more than we trust what our bodies themselves are telling us. And that is an example of storytelling, which along with metaphor is your second most powerful tool. Does that make sense? When I tell you a specific story, it's because I'm trying to drive home a specific point. The structure of a really helpful educational story it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the idea you want the person to take home should come right in the middle. The perfect example of an educational story is 2 sentences. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Because the listener is like, I too in my life have been lost and wanted to be found. Here is a person who was found. What was it that came along that helped them to feel found? Why, it was Amazing Grace. Is Amazing Grace a song here? Are you all like, I have no idea. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Okay. I once was lost, but now I'm found because of Amazing Grace. So when you're telling stories, you choose stories based on what happens right in the middle that saves your hero and heroine. What could have fixed the problem? What could have fixed the problem in Anna and Christian's situation there in the first spanking scene is if either one of them had known about arousal non-concordance. I have an infinite range of stories that illustrate if only people had known about arousal non-concordance. I had a friend who was playing with BDSM for the first time in her life, so she was tied up with her arms over her head, and her partner set her up so she was straddling a bar like a broomstick, and he was pressing directly against her clitoris. And her partner, who was dominating her, left the room. Power play. Leave her alone to think about what she's done and anticipate what he's gonna do. My friend's there. I am bored. I am bored, and then he comes back in and she says, I am bored. This is boring. And he looks at her, and he looks at the bar, and he says, then why are you wet? Why was she wet? She had pressure directly against her clitoris. That is a very sex-related stimulus. And it goes in both directions, literally a phone call. Hi, Emily, is it okay if I ask you a sex question? Of course it's okay. You're the one too, right? People like call and are like, can I ask you a sex question? Go for it. So we're in the middle of all the things and it's going great. And I'm like, I want you. I'm ready. Let's do it. And he goes, no, you're still dry. You're just being nice. So is it hormonal? Should I see a doctor? What's the matter? What was the matter? As arousal non-concordance. Sometimes there is just not a match between what your genitals are doing and how turned on you feel. It happens all the time. People with penises may struggle to get an erection, especially sometimes erectile dysfunction happens when you're like very, very glad to be with someone, so much so that the performance pressure just like makes everything shut down. So you struggle to get an erection when you would really like one. And then you wake up the very next morning with an erection when it is nothing but an annoyance, right? Arousal non-concordance. And you know, you can see that it is normal in those contexts, right? If only people knew about this. The thing is, 50 Shades of Grey sold like 50 million copies. So until I tell 50 million people about arousal non-concordance, my job will not be done. So it would help me out a lot if you could just tell everyone you meet that just because your genitals are doing one thing doesn't mean that the rest of you feels any particular way about that. It just means something sex-related happened. It doesn't mean it's what you want or like. This is not an idea that is like the phenomenon of arousal non-concordance is extremely familiar to therapists who work with survivors of sexual trauma. A large proportion, somewhere between 20 and 30% of trauma survivors experience significant genital response up to and including orgasm during a sexual assault. And therapists are called in to testify as experts in court cases because, yes, the defendant's lawyer will try to introduce the physiological response of the victim as evidence of consent. That's a thing that really happens. And so the expert therapist is called in to say, yes, arousal non-concordance is a thing that happens. Sometimes bodies just respond. It's a protective response. Part of the importance of genital blood flow for vaginas in particular is the lubrication reduces friction, which reduces tearing, which reduces risk of sexually transmitted infection. So it's helpful that your body might respond even in a case where you don't want or like what is happening. So you may one day be called upon to testify, and certainly to explain to a survivor of trauma that it is a thing that happens. We live in a sufficiently broken world that some of the things that are sex-related that happen to our bodies are neither wanted nor liked, and certainly not consented to. Does that make sense? Okay, storytelling and metaphor.
Are the questions allowed?
Sure, questions. Yes.
Should I use? Yes.
Yes, microphone.
Okay, so Emily, you're talking about the cases when you just talked about the case when a woman wants subjectively want to have sex, but her body doesn't respond. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's just a matter of time. Like when, so it is very common when women want it in their head, but like they don't just give enough time for body to respond. Yeah. So it's like, okay, so it's okay, okay.
Yeah, sometimes it is just a matter of time. It takes, our bodies are not designed to tolerate intercourse that lasts more than a few minutes. Our natural lubricant is just not enough for that. I am a lube evangelist. Anyone having genital contact involving any kind of friction should be using some kind of lubricant if it lasts more than just a few minutes. And it takes time for blood flow to increase. And you have to, and it varies from person to person and from context to context how long it takes for genitals to warm up. You have to preheat the oven. Sometimes the preheating begins, you know, if you've got a hot date Friday night and you know that it's coming Tuesday morning, the oven begins to preheat Tuesday morning. Sometimes the oven doesn't begin to preheat 20 years down the line in that same relationship. The oven begins to preheat when the reminder pops up in your calendar that it's date night and you're like, okay, well, let me get 50 Shades of Grey, go sit in the bathtub, let the good times roll. And you like begin the warm up that way. That's a perfectly legit, reasonable way to do it. Or you could be like, hey partner, this is gonna be 100% your job. Here I am, make it happen. And as long as the accelerator's being hit and the brakes are coming off, there are so many parts about turning off the brake that are easy. As long as your like relationship quality is good. Okay, here's the checklist. If people are struggling, here are the things to remember. The individual's personal well-being, both physical and mental. 2, their partner characteristics. And don't just think in terms of physical attractiveness. I'm not allowed to tell a lot of stories about my sister, but this is one of them. She's been with her husband for over 20 years. And she's a choral conductor, he's a musician too. He, in 20 years, has not figured out that when he practices piano, she sits in the living room listening to him in the piano room practicing, and he has not yet figured out that he is more likely to get laid on the days when he practices, because she finds his practicing really good. When my husband writes a comic that I find really funny, like that's a sexually relevant stimulus for me. So partner characteristics, it's more than just physical appearance. It's sense of humor, it's strength, it's sweetness and charm. So we have personal health, partner characteristics, relationship characteristics, the most essential of which, of course, is trust. Are you there for me? Partners are there for each other. Setting. I use the Titanic as another example. Do you remember this scene? I don't know, Titanic. This is probably too old a reference now. But there's Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet are on the Titanic and they fall in love and they have sex in the backseat of a car parked on the Titanic the night that it goes down. And probably also Leonardo DiCaprio goes down. That was a cunnilingus pun for those getting the translation. So the setting there is like you're on the Titanic. It is this like short duration that you're going to be together and then you're going to be separated. It's for them a very sexy setting. For some people, the best, sexiest setting is the same bed they've had sex in every night for the last 10 years with the door locked, with the same person in the same position. They just love the comfort and familiarity of it. It just feels perfect for them. For some people, it's going to be at a party, at a stranger's house, in the closet against a wall of other people's coats. Different people enjoy different settings. On vacation, at your own home, in a hotel. I met one woman who, she had great sex at this one particular vacation home, and she was like, why is it so great at this one house? And it turned out the house was so old, the bed was built into the wall, so there was no squeaking sound. And they had 3 kids. So she knew the kids were not hearing the squeaking sound. So when they built a house, they built the bed into the wall. So what is it about the setting that is working for you? My favorite is ludic factors. Ludic comes from the same root as ludicrous. It means play. Can you romp with your partner? Can you try new things? Because the deal is, consenting adults, there is no script. There is no set of rules you have to follow. It's consenting adults. You're allowed to do anything you want to. If you want to fuck your partner's armpit, fuck your partner's armpit. There's a word for it. It's called axillary intercourse. People like it when there's names for stuff. If you want your partner to fuck between the arches of your feet, you can go ahead and do that. If you want them to lick right there between the arches of your feet. I couldn't find a word for licking between the arches of the feet, so I made one up. Interplantar linctus. It has a name. Now you can do it. You're allowed to. There is no rule. There is, apart from like, do both people agree to be there? And are both people free not to be there if they decide not to be? That's it. You can do anything you want. Ludic factors, playing, romping. In game design, they have a thing they call the magic circle, which is this mental space you enter where you shed the benign and ordinary aspects of your identity and only bring into this magic circle the parts of your identity that are necessary for this game you're going to be playing together. So you leave outside corporate lady. You leave outside the magic circle, mommy. You leave outside the magic circle, like cook and housekeeper and and daughter and sister. You leave all that stuff out. And all that's left in the circle is the sexy lady and the sexy partner. The process of shifting from your ordinary state of mind into the magic circle state of mind is a ritual process that everyone is going to do differently. And when you can do that, when you're helping your clients, you talk about, okay, so tell me about a time when you were in a thing that feels like, yeah, the magic circle, when it was just your bodies together playing the same game and it felt joyful and connected. Now, what did it take to get you there? You work your way back. Or imagine that you are there. Imagine a world where you managed to make it to the magic circle together. What are the steps you took to get you there? Another one of my favorite techniques, apart from, there's like the sort of like back engineering of it, is to use motivational interviewing, especially if you have reluctant or resistant clients who are just sitting there in a stew of like shame and lockdown and I'm not allowed to think outside the box and oh my God, Emily, I can't believe you just said lick people's feet. I can't even listen anymore. You start you make a grid on a piece of paper. Okay, so let's talk about what are some of the good things about doing things differently? What are some of the not so good things about doing things differently? What are some of the good things about doing things the same way? And what are some of the good, not so good things about doing things the same way? So you've got these 4 boxes, you've got this grid, and you go one by one, and it's even best if you like give it to the client and make them fill out the chart, and you get through all 4 boxes, and you go, okay. So when you look at these 4 charts, the good things of staying the same, the not so good things of staying the same, the good things of changing, the not so good things of changing, what do you see? What do you notice? Have there been any times when you've gotten most of that good stuff and avoided some of that not so good stuff? Okay. And if you decided to, the if is really important, if you decided to create change, how confident do you feel that you could if you wanted to, on a scale of 0 to 10? Okay, suppose they say 3. Not super confident, but great. What makes it a 3 and not a 1? And what do you think it could take to nudge that up to a 4 or maybe even a 5? Like, what could happen that would nudge that up? This is motivational interviewing. And after you do confidence, you do importance. How important is it to you to make that change? Given all the good stuff and the not so, how important is it to you to create this change? And if they're like a 0 or a 1, like, you're done. That person is not motivated to create any kind of change. And that's up to them, okay. But if they're like, it actually is a 7 or an 8 level of important, okay, what makes it a 7 or an 8? Like, what makes this important for you? And what could you imagine happening that might nudge that up to a 9 even, right? So you're sort of like figuring out what matters for them, what are their priorities in terms of making this change. Does that make sense? Motivational interviewing is surprisingly powerful when you're talking with couples about sexuality. I don't know why it's not more commonly written about. I know people use it all the time. I started using it around drinking behavior and adapted the drinking protocol to a sex protocol as I was being trained to do HIV prevention education. And then from HIV prevention education, P.S., it is a powerfully evidence-based intervention for HIV prevention, I adapted it further to sexual desire and like making the most of like planning and scheduling sex, because people get resistant about scheduling sex. They feel like it's not romantic enough. Did anybody hear me talk about the hedgehog metaphor? Almost no one. It's too long a story to tell. Damn it. Okay, basically, hedgehogs are this ridiculous metaphor that I use for difficult feelings. See, because if you've got like these sleepy hedgehogs, like there's a sleepy hedgehog sitting in your chair, and you need to set it free. You have to be really careful in the way that you deal with it. In my relationship, I spent all this time writing a book about sex, thinking about sex all the time, and being so stressed about sex that I never wanted to have any sex. And then I spent all this time traveling all over, talking with everyone who would listen about sex. And by the time I got home, I was so like tired and exhausted. We'd like get together and I would just literally fall asleep before he made it to the bed. So over the months, this accumulated all these sleepy hedgehogs, all these difficult feelings, this feeling of like loneliness and isolation and frustration and some resentment and fear and worry about the disconnect that was happening between us. And our job was to very gently take each of these difficult feelings and set it free. My husband is a cartoonist, and as we were going through this process, he actually drew a little picture of our bed with an escalator for the hedgehogs to go down, and he drew a little hedge along the wall of our bedroom to give them a place to live so they weren't on the bed anymore. And I can think of nothing more romantic, nothing sexier than the fact that he felt like it was worth all that effort just to have sex with me. He was willing to like sit there and talk about our feelings. It took hours. Talking about our feelings. But it mattered that much to him because he fucking loves me. Holy crap. So when people are resistant to the idea of scheduling sex or planning sex, you can reframe it easily as a date and as showing your partner how worth it they are to you, how much it matters to you that you stay connected in this way. Does that make sense? I can't tell if that was too quick explanation of the sleepy hedgehog thing. Because there's fixing the sexual problem, and then there's dealing with all the feelings caused by the sexual problem. Which do you think is more difficult? The feelings are so much more difficult. Sexual problems are generally fairly straightforward, but repairing the damage that we do to each other, all the like, I don't know what's wrong with me, but your criticism isn't helping. And well, if you loved me, you would. And I don't know what's wrong, but if you would just stop criticizing me, maybe I wouldn't. And you're just not there for me. And all the hurt feelings. Like that is what actually causes the problem. It's not so much the sex itself. It's the how do we cope with all the feelings? Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, because it's on my list, and oh my God, I can't believe it's already 8 o'clock. How did that happen? Is 2 more techniques that I find to be really helpful when you're working with individuals or couples. One is physical movement. Very often we feel like, I don't know, how did it come to be that clients are like stapled to their chairs? They like have to sit there and just talk to each other about their feelings. It can be incredibly helpful to have people like get up and move their bodies around. Like, for example, you can have people explore how their connection feels. There's, if you have them stand face to face and palm to palm and lean into each other so that if either one lets go, one would fall down. Is that what their relationship feels like? You have them hold hands and lean back so that if either one let go, they would both fall backwards. Does their relationship feel like that? You can have them both stand over their own center of gravity and just put their arms around each other and hold each other for 20 seconds. This is the 20-second hug. And feel, is that what their relationship feels like, where they can each hold their own weight but still be that close to each other? Do they feel like their relationship feels more like when they stand face to face with each other? Or does their relationship feel more like they're both standing and facing in the same direction? Like, or, and here's where you get into the dark part, do they feel like they're standing facing each other? Or has one of them got their back turned? Or do they both have their back turned? And how does that feel for them to stand with their back turned? And if one partner has their back turned, ask them to switch. Hey, partner A with your back turned, why don't you turn and face partner B? And hey, partner B, how about you try turning away? What does that feel like? Or have them stand back to back. What does that feel like? To stay, you can't see each other's faces. Now, I want one of you to make a choice. So partner A, I'd like you to take a step back or not. You can make a choice of whether to take one step away from your partner or not. And then they make a choice. And people are having all kinds of feelings about whether somebody chose simply to take one step back. And of course, there's the classic, like, just stand up and create as much physical space between your bodies as you need in order to feel like there's no pressure and no expectation. And usually it's like 4 or 5 feet, but sometimes it's 20 feet of space is how much space the lower desire partner needs. Does that make sense? Get them out of their chair and have them move their bodies around to see how they physically feel in these different configurations. And let them spend time with their bodies in that place. People can tap into feelings in a really big way, just by positioning their bodies in these different ways, as opposed to them sitting there like facing you, both like looking at you, like you're gonna give them the answer, like you're the one who's gonna, tell them how to make their way back to sex with each other. It's not going to come from you. God, if only it were that easy. Here's the map. Here's the toolkit. You have fun, kids. Last technique, this is one I learned from Gina Ogden, a sex therapist who passed away last year. She was a mentor for me, and this is maybe my favorite tool that I ever learned from her. It's the 2 objects exercise. So you have the client bring in one object that represents something they want to hold on to in their sexuality, and a second object that represents something they want to let go of. People get stuck if they think too hard about what the object is. Give them a time limit if they're the kind of person who like needs to find the perfect object. If you feel like they're going to get trapped and like, no, but it needs to be exactly right. Like 3 minutes is all you get. Go around your place and find one thing that represents something you want to hold on to and something you want to get rid of. So you take the thing that represents what you want to hold on to and you write it a letter all about your relationship, how you met this aspect of their sexuality they want to hang on to, what it means to them, all the good things it has brought to their life, and what they hope for their future with this aspect of their sexuality. And then there's the object that represents something they want to let go of. And they write essentially a farewell letter. They write how they met and what impact it has had on their lives to have this thing. And was there something they learned as a result of having this unwanted experience, this thing they're ready to let go of? Can they offer gratitude for whatever that lesson was? And then they can say a gentle goodbye and they can literally discard the item in a way that feels good, or they can just like separate their sense of that aspect of their sexuality they want to get rid of from the object. Which it's amazing how much a person can experience just by going like, okay, so it's a coffee cup, and they just go like, and now the coffee cup is empty, and it's just a coffee cup again. Does that make sense? So those are some of the things that I have seen work for people, especially when they get stuck in their brains and in trying to explain and understand and intellectualize. Russian people, I'm sure, never intellectualize sexuality, right? That never happens. Oh, wait, that's everyone. Okay, good, yeah. Moving your bodies instead, externalizing it in objects that are symbols, and having people think through the cost-benefit list, cost of staying the same, good things about staying the same, cost of change, good things about change, motivational interviewing. And that's my time. Those are the things that I had on my list. I would be very happy to answer the questions that you've been thinking about this whole time. Oh, you went and heard Emily Nagоски, the sex educator? What did you learn?
You make it creepy.
I make it creepy. I don't mean to be creepy. No. This is my Christian Grey voice.
Can I just ask?
Yes.
Right? I still, sorry.
I have a translator. You can ask in Russian if you like.
Окей. Все еще довольно сильно ориентируюсь на реакцию тела. Вы можете помочь мне, рассказать мне, как мне перестать это делать и больше слышать то, чего я хочу?
Oh, yeah. So when you're focused on what, it's not a bad thing to be listening to the body. The main thing is to be able to understand the body's signals in a holistic sense. Because, especially if you get gender socialized feminine, but really everybody is taught to believe other people's opinions. I'm afraid I'm going to recommend mindfulness. I know. It is a strongly evidence-based practice. I hope that there is a Russian translation of a book by Lori Brotto, Lori, B-R-O. The title is Better Sex Through Mindfulness, and it's about using a mindfulness practice of simply noticing what's going on in your body and your thoughts and your emotions in a non-judgmental way. The key here, it is not the paying attention that matters. It is the non-judgment. It is the not having an opinion that matters most. One of the most powerful exercises I learned from Lori is putting yourself in a position of physical discomfort. So for example, if you raise your arm, if you feel like it, you can raise your arm above your head. And so you just keep your arm above your head and you keep breathing. You just notice what it feels like to have your arm above your head. And you keep breathing and you keep noticing what it feels like to have your arm above your head. And then you begin to notice that you have some feelings about what it feels like to have your arm above your head. Is, oh, look, interesting. The blood is sort of draining away from my fingertips and they're kind of tingly, and that's interesting. My shoulder's starting to get a little stiff and sore. And you know what I'm really noticing is this impulse to put my hand down because of how uncomfortable it's getting. That's really interesting. The neutral, non-judgmental awareness of your internal experience is the most powerful tool you have in expanding your ability to know what your comprehensive internal experience is. And my hand is still up, and I'm still noticing that, like, my body's like, hey, you should put your hand down because your arm's getting sore and there's no blood in your fingertips anymore. But my job is just to neutrally notice this. She has her clients sit there for 15 minutes, just noticing the discomfort. You can also do it by stretching any muscle in your body, or by stretching a tendon, or by using pressure. She suggested, I've never done this, pulling a nostril hair, because it's really uncomfortable. I must say that even though mindfulness is a strongly evidence-based practice, it does not work for me, so it might not work for you. And if that is the case, if you're a person who, when you try to like step outside the flowing stream of your own thoughts and just observe them, if what you have is not a gently flowing stream that you've stepped out of, but something more like 12 fire hoses spraying water really hard, if that's what the inside of your mind is like me, I find it much easier to practice a more active kind of intervention, a body-based therapy like somatic experiencing or psychomotor therapy. Pat Ogden is the author of Psychomotor Therapy, which require you to move your body in these stereotyped like physiological ways. Like as I'm recovering from trauma, my somatosensory experiencing practitioner will put her palms against my palms and put almost no pressure against it. And I'm pushing back and pushing back and pushing back. And all the resistance is coming from inside my own muscles. And I'm letting my body let go of a lot of stuff. So if you tend to focus in the body, this can help you distinguish between what the body is doing and what's happening in your heart and mind. That's what it does for me anyway. So if you find mindfulness is, if you're like, oh, fucking mindfulness, Jesus. Try body-based therapy like somatic experiencing or psychomotor therapy. And another one is like, just, God, really? Yoga. When research was done on survivors of the 9/11 terror attacks in New York City, you know what intervention was most effective in helping people heal from that trauma? Yoga.
Like what kind of yoga? Like what aspects of yoga?
They didn't ask that question. It's yoga. Yoga. Yeah, yoga's lots of things, but the main thing that matters about yoga is that you pay attention to what's happening with your body. What's happening with your body is usually so intense that it's really difficult to pay attention to anything else. You focus on your breathing and you let your body tremble and you honor your body's signals. That's what matters about yoga. I can say that my favorite yoga instructor available on the internet is a teacher named Jessamine Stanley. She has an app. This is a hashtag not spawn. Is that a thing in Russian? This is not sponsored. She doesn't pay me. I just love her a lot, and I tell everyone about her. She has an app called Underbelly Yoga, where she just like does yoga postures and leads you through 30-minute yoga sessions. But it is not about the reason I love her so much is she says things like, if you come to one of my classes and you just lie on the mat in corpse pose, farting and crying for half an hour, I will throw you a party. Because that is the yoga. That's the yoga. It's not about the postures. It's about the awareness and the being present with what your body needs. So underbelly yoga. So those are some of the strategies for getting out of just noticing what the body wants and noticing the connection between your physical experience and the emotions and thoughts that go with it. I'll add one more thing, which is a story from my sister. When she was learning about this whole like dealing with her stress and paying attention to her body's signals, instead of she would go to the gym and exercise on the elliptical machine, the elliptical, and she would just get hot and sweaty after half an hour. But instead, when she started really needing to like process and purge her rage, she began imagining herself as Godzilla on the elliptical, tromping on the administrative buildings and the parking lot and all the assholes in her program. And instead of just feeling hot and sweaty and tired at the end of her workout, she felt like victorious, like she had conquered the universe because she had tied her imagination to the physical experience of using that energy. And it's building those bridges between the emotion and the physical experience that most powerfully allows our body to become free. One of the things we discovered in the process, this is a long answer, but I love this question so much. One of the things we discovered in the process of writing Burnout is that wellness is not a state of mind. It isn't even a state of being. It is a state of action. It is the freedom for our bodies to move through the complete cycles and oscillations of living in a mammalian body, all the way through the stress response cycle. This one's crucial, all the way through the oscillation into deep connection with other people, and then back out into autonomy, and then back into connection, and then back into autonomy, to oscillate from effort, intensive, focused effort, into rest, and then back into effort, and then back into rest. There's no contradiction here. The state of nature of a human being is this movement and flow from one state to another in these predictable oscillations. And when we can recognize what our bodies feel like moving that way and allow our hearts and minds to move with it so that we're never stuck in one place, but constantly moving from one place, knowing that where we are now is not where we are always going to be, that is what true wellness looks like. And the best predictor of a woman's sexual well-being is her overall well-being. So this building bridges between the physical body and the emotional body is like the most fundamental groundwork we can lay for maximizing sexual well-being. I hope that was fun for you to listen to because I enjoyed saying it. Oh, let's pass her a book. Here's the thing. I have these 2 signed books to give away to people who ask questions, and you were brave and asked the first question. It was a fucking awesome question, so you get a book. Can we pass that back? Yes. Cool.
What is sex education like in the United States? At what age do you think is appropriate to introduce sex to children? Obviously, it's such a big stigma in Russia. I currently live in the United Kingdom, but I spent 21 years here, and I'm just visiting. It's a great lecture. Thank you very much. I work with kids. It's fascinating.
Yes. Oh, kids. Sex education in the United States varies hugely from state to state. In some states, there are laws against teaching anything other than abstinence only until marriage. And in other states, like the one where I live, there are now laws, I believe, mandating comprehensive, age-appropriate sex education that teaches about STI prevention, pregnancy prevention, consent, and communication in relationships, so preventing relationship violence. Tremendously varied. Many of you will be familiar with the last 50 years of research, which have unequivocally concluded that abstinence only until marriage education results in more sexually transmitted infections, more unwanted pregnancies, which means more abortions, and also earlier sexual debut. So if you want kids to have more sex sooner and more dangerously, definitely don't give them any sex education. If, on the other hand, you are interested in kids delaying sex, and when they choose to have that sex, using protection for their health and their partner's health and having more consensual relationships, comprehensive evidence-based sex education beginning the day they're born, essentially. A woman tweeted me a story. She read Come As You Are, and then she watched her adult brother change his baby daughter's diaper. And when the baby was all clean and dad went to get a clean diaper, the little girl reached down and touched her own clitoris. And dad said, don't touch that. What would he have said if his baby had a penis instead? What would he have said if his baby had touched her feet instead? Man, when our babies find their feet, we have a party. You found your feet. That's so cute, right? Now, she's not going to remember this one little moment, but it will accumulate with countless similar moments, reinforcing the idea that this part of her body does not belong to her and is not hers to do with as she pleases. Whether we like it or not, we are educating our kids about sexuality from the day they are born. The question is, what are we teaching them? And what I got taught was, Mom, what's vagina? And clearly I got over it. Like, look at me now. But we get to make choices. How do we want our kids to feel about their bodies and their sexuality? Do we want girls to feel like they have autonomy over their own bodies? There are definitely people who do not want girls to feel like they have autonomy over their bodies, for sure. But let me offer a counterpoint story. I was doing a therapist training in Rhode Island, and a therapist came up to me afterward and told me about a story when her daughter was just 2 years old. And she was on this like bouncy ball with a handle, you know, bouncy, 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 is that a thing? Bouncy balls. And she's like, Mommy, this feels really good. And her mom goes, yeah, honey, that's your clitoris. And at 2 years old, this little girl says, my clitoris is my favorite. Again, this is a moment she's too young to remember, but it will accumulate with countless other similar moments that teach her that her entire body belongs to her to do with as she pleases. She gets to choose when and how she is touched. She knows what pleasure feels like in her body, so that whenever she's with a partner and her partner asks her, does this feel good? She will know the answer. When you are a human giver and somebody asks you, does this feel good? Mostly it's your job to be like, But if she knows what pleasure feels like and knows that her body belongs to her, she can be like, you know what would feel really good is if you did this other thing. And she knows that because she has that experience and because she knows that her body is hers to do with as she chooses. So obviously we want it to be age appropriate. The curriculum I am most familiar with that I feel like does a great job of age appropriate, comprehensive sex education is the Unitarian Universalist curriculum, Our Whole Lives. You might be familiar with it.
I think globally we're missing sex education for children.
Oh yeah, globally we are missing sex education for children. There is a very real fear that if you talk to a child about sex, you will give them the idea to have sex, because they weren't going to have that idea anyway. It is definitely not true. The deal is people they are afraid that talking about sex is the same thing as engaging sexually with a child, and it absolutely is not. But people are really afraid that that communicating about sex is somehow being sexual with a child. And I think that comes from reactions like my mom of not knowing, of being so afraid of sex herself that she doesn't know how to communicate confidently with strong boundaries about sexuality. I have a great friend at home with 2 daughters, and because she's a sex educator with 2 daughters, she lives in a household where they say things like, we don't touch our vulvas at the dinner table. Which is like, that's clear communication, and it's the sort of thing we would definitely say to children with penises, like, not at the dinner table, honey. Thank you, please go wash your hands. That's not shaming, that's just like, there are boundaries, and we set limits. Does that make sense? Is it in Russian? There's a wonderful book by Corey Silverberg called What Makes a Baby? For the earliest questions of where do babies come from, Corey Silverberg's What Makes a Baby. He talked to all different kinds of families whose children came into their lives all different kinds of ways, from in vitro fertilization to penile vaginal intercourse to adoption. And it ends with this beautiful, like, who waited for you? Because what it all boils down to was somebody was waiting for you. They were ready. And so it's lovely. That's a great book for tiny, tiny children. There was a third question. Oh, and here's the other book. Question over here. Yeah, microphone. Thank you.
А как, по вашему мнению, сексуальность коррелирует с самооценкой, и как сделать так, чтобы в те периоды, когда я не чувствую себя сексуальной, моя самооценка не падала, не опускалась ниже и ниже?
I don't know. I think, so self-esteem is the phrase that got translated to. And I think the entire concept of self-esteem is dicey at best. It is sketchy. I don't love it because self-esteem is, in its definition, conditional on certain things. Like, can I still like myself if I am not sexual? Can I still like myself if I don't behave in certain sexual ways? There's a researcher named Kristen Neff, Kristen with a K, Neff, N-E-F-F, who began her career as a postdoc studying self-esteem, and she realized that self-esteem wasn't working. Self-esteem was turning children into bullies because they needed to be better than someone in order to feel good about themselves. So she switched from studying self-esteem to studying self-compassion. How can we be kind and loving toward ourselves, no matter what? She tells a really beautiful story. She has an autistic son. She was on a plane with her 10-year-old autistic son when he has a meltdown, like autistic kids do sometimes, on a plane, trapped on a plane. So she tries to just like carry him into the restroom, and of course the restroom is occupied. So she's holding her tantruming 10-year-old on an airplane. And you know, like, there's people on, like, how would you feel if there's a tantruming 10-year-old on your plane? Like, your first reaction is often like, ugh, really? So her job in that moment, she knew from her research, was not to judge whether she was a good parent or not to judge whether she had a good child or not, but to turn with loving kindness toward her own suffering and say, oh, this is so hard. I know, this is really hard. You're going to get through it. Everybody's had a moment like this in their lives, and you're going to be okay. The 3 main components of self-compassion are obviously self-kindness, common humanity, which is recognizing the universality of suffering, that not only is suffering common, it is the thing that ties us all together, that we all have suffered. We don't need to hide our suffering from each other because it is the thing that binds us together. And then finally, loving kindness. I might be wrong about what the third thing is. Somebody might know what the third technical, well, anyway. Self-compassion. So I don't know what the research says about the relationship between self-esteem and sexuality, but if I were like in an advice-giving mode, I'd be like, fuck self-esteem, forget self-esteem. Self-esteem has nothing to do with anything. You get to love you every day just for the fact that you're sitting there breathing. just the way everybody else here gets to love you just for sitting there breathing. And we each get to sit here on the day we were born. I said this on Saturday, but I'm going to say it again because it matters a lot to me. On the day we're born, most of us are lucky enough to have at least one adult who holds our tiny, brand new bodies and calls us beautiful and perfect. And they're right. And nothing has changed between that day and this one. We don't need self-esteem. We were born beautiful and perfect. Even though the world began from that very first day to begin telling us all the things that are wrong with us, all the ways that we fall short of some ideal. There is this sort of like fictional fantasy version of ourselves of what we're supposed to be. And we're constantly measuring ourselves against that person, this fictional fantasy versus who we are. And we will always feel crazy and broken if we think that who we actually are is not lovable until we are this. You will never be the fantasy. None of us will ever be the fantasy. And the more we can turn with kindness and compassion toward the part of ourselves that is sad and frustrated and grieving that we will never be this thing, the better off we'll be. In the same way that when a baby cries because there's something missing from its life, you turn toward a crying baby with loving kindness and compassion. Sexuality is just one of many of the components of a person's well-being. It can be a source of beauty and joy and confidence and love and connection. It can feel literally like a connection with the divine. And it can also feel literally worse than death. It is not any one of those things, it is all of them. So I don't tie sexuality to a person's self-worth at all. It gets to happen on each individual's own terms. My one wish for humanity is simply basic bodily autonomy, that we each get to choose how and when and by whom we are touched. That's the measure of whether sex is good and right, and it never has any relationship to whether a person is lovable. You're already lovable, you're doing it right. Does that make sense? Self-compassion. Look up Kristen Neff, N-E-F-F.
У нас есть еще время на один вопрос, потому что мы вынуждены завершать.
Yes.
Спасибо большое за лекцию и вообще за то просветительское такое слово, которое вы несете в мир. Мой вопрос связан с тем, что, как вы сказали, на многие культуры, вообще сексуальность, она поддается влиянию культурного такого сильного дискурса. И в нашей стране есть разные регионы, в которых это влияние наиболее сильное, и тема сексуальности вообще она такая табуированная, и даже в некоторых особенных частях даже практикуется такая, извините, практика, как женское обрезание и подобное. И в таких регионах как вести вот эту вот просветительскую деятельность, и что вообще по этому поводу думаете? Это вообще... Извините, что не до конца сформулированный вопрос.
Yeah, I didn't know that clitoridectomies were a thing in Russia. That's news to me.
Not everywhere.
Just in some places.
Very, very close society, and it's not very loud. But it exists. But it exists.
In some areas, in some regions.
Unofficially, it still exists.
Okay. So this is a complicated question, primarily because I am not a member of those communities, and therefore it is not up to me to judge or make a decision about what's right or wrong. Again, my wish for the world is that everyone has basic bodily autonomy, and that includes not cutting healthy tissue without a person's consent, and children are not of an age where they can give consent. If at an adult age they choose that, that is a choice people get to make. I feel the same way about circumcision, that like if you want to have healthy tissue removed at the age of consent, do you. And if we are going to move toward a world where people delay that choice until they are of an age of giving consent. It has to happen from within the community. It is just another form of colonization and oppression if the dominant culture marches in and says, we know how to do this right, you're doing it wrong, you need to stop doing it, this is a form of torture, it's bad and evil and wrong. Like, it's not up to us to go into a place and tell people how they ought to be having sex any more than I would want anyone to come into my house and tell me that how I'm doing sex is right or wrong. My whole career is devoted to being like, you are allowed, you can lick the insides of feet if you want. Consent is all we're looking for. I know that there are programs in a variety of nations and cultures where this is a thing, and where it's most effective is when it is a process of community-based, participatory research and intervention. There's a pretty substantial body of research now on what the effective strategies are, and they always stem from inside the community rather than someone from the outside coming in and creating change.
How to be self-aware in these cultures if it can be dangerous in this society?
So, do you know how I was talking about harm reduction? What are some of the good things? What are the not so good things? Yeah.
Это был скорее такой экстремальный пример. Есть и, менее такие жесткие практики, просто, да, культурные какие-то стереотипы, когда вот это вот осознанность своей сексуальности, ее принятие становится в некотором смысле, таким порицаемым обществом и в некотором смысле даже опасным. Как быть вот такой вот осознанной в своей сексуальности, когда культура это очень сильно порицает?
Very slowly. I mean, okay. Here's why I have a great deal of hope, even though in my own country, things have been going backwards fast for the last couple of years. Like, actual legal protections are being rolled back in a way that feels really scary to me. Despite that, I have hope because I look at what has happened over the last 100 years, even over the last 50 years, even over the last 20 years. I think about how far we've come just since the Me Too movement expanded globally. I see so much change happening. I feel like it's inevitable that we are moving in a direction of basic bodily autonomy. It feels inevitable to me that we will arrive at a place where people get to choose for themselves how and when they are touched, and that will be true for everybody. That's the trajectory. It is going to be slow. It will not exist before I die. I'm never going to see it. But hopefully I'll live long enough to see it be even better than it is now. And I know that I can mark our progress best by looking at the people who are the most vulnerable on Earth, looking at global poverty, looking particularly at women of color in hemispheric South countries, getting access to economic and educational opportunities. We know that we can change the world. We can save entire communities by giving women and girls economic and educational opportunities, access to safe, accessible, and affordable effective contraception, and comprehensive evidence-based sex education that emphasizes consent and nonviolent communication strategies. We know, here's the thing, we know how to do it. Knowledge is not the problem here. It's simply the will to continue fighting. Here's what I envision, especially when I come to a place like this. I'm standing on the shore with my little bucket, trying to move the shoreline. So I take a bucket and I pitch some sand out, and I take a bucket and I pitch some sand out, and it feels like I'm doing nothing. But I look to my left, and there's 1 million women doing the same thing. And I look to my right, and there's 1 million more women doing the same thing. And when I think about all of us doing this together, each of us with our one little bucket doing our little piece of the work, I feel nothing but inspired. The reason I will fly across 7 time zones and be away from my husband and my dog, who I miss a lot, is because I get to look at the faces of the people who are standing with me, with our buckets, just like gradually making this change. I know that it's happening. It's too slow for me to see it in the moment, but if I look back over the last 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, I can see the difference in where the shoreline is. I know that we are moving it, and we're going to keep moving it. All we have to do is not stop. Does that help?
Вау.
Not just women, everybody.
Эмили, спасибо большое.
Thank you. Thank you.
Спасибо огромное, правда. Блестяще, прекрасно, как всегда, совершенно замечательно. Я прошу тех, у кого наушники на столах, да, оставить их на столах, а тех, кому их надо сдать, пожалуйста, на выходе подойти, да, и сдать. И это все будет записано, и, мы думаем, выложено в общий доступ в том числе.
Дорогие друзья, сейчас, Полина. У нас велась фотосъемка. Если кто-то против того, чтобы его фотографии появлялись в соцсетях, то подойдите ко мне. Мы с вами про это договоримся, окей?
А у меня очень хорошие новости, пока вы все не убежали. Издательство «Миф» сделало подарок. Я не успела приготовить слайд. Но если вы введете имя Эмили в поле для промокода на сайте МИФ, вы можете получить 20% скидку на все их книжки. Пользуйтесь.
Спасибо, доброго вечера.
20%.